Hey guys, and welcome to Sounds Like NYC, the only podcast dedicated to spotlighting New York City talent. I'm David, and today we have a New York City-based author, Thomas Dyja. His newest work, New York, New York, New York: 4 Decades of Success, Excess, and Transformation, is out in bookstores and online now. You can find him on Instagram at tdyja, that's Dyja, and at thomasdyja.com. Please welcome Thomas.
Hey, thanks for having me,
Woo!
David.
Thanks so much for coming on. So I'm gonna be honest with you. You sent me the book. I've only gotten maybe like a quarter of the way because it's just so much in there. I have to reread pages just to get the actual like whole context of the whole situation.
There's a lot.
But it's it's a really good book
Thanks, man.
for someone who's like lived in the city his whole life and just thought things are the way because that's just how they are. There's like so much that happened in the past that has made it to what it is now. It's just really, I don't know, I guess refreshing to see like, why things are the way they are. So I
I
appreciate
mean,
that.
that's history, and I think one of the things about New York is that even when you grow up here, I mean, I've raised my kids in New York, and so many people come here from other places, other parts of the country and the world, and everybody believes like here's what was, and now I'm here, and now it all
Exactly.
begins. It started when I got here, and so I really wanted to kind of give some background. People my age, it's been, you told the story of my years in New York, which was cool, and I enjoy that. But it was also really intended for people who weren't there for the whole time to get a sense of how things got to where they are. I mean, when you look at Brooklyn, people talking about, oh, I moved there and then all the gentrifiers came. And it's like, well, actually you might have been one because there were ones 20 years before you. I mean, to help people kind of get a context of how things really happened in the city, and
Mhm.
as a way to help us think about what's coming next.
For sure. I mean, I think that's definitely something that we need right now with, is it, I saw something on Facebook, could be, maybe something that somebody made up, but De Blasio said that he's going to open up again the city like in
I
July.
saw that too. I saw that July 1st. So
That's kind of crazy.
fingers crossed, man. Folks, get out there and get your vaccines. I mean, I got my
Yeah.
two, and it's that will be possible. I think if everybody gets vaxxed, it
Hmm.
is possible.
Yeah, I mean, I got my vaccine too, and like it was only I only felt the first shot, and then the second was like easy peasy.
Good, it's different for everybody. The second one knocked me on my butt for a day, but 2 weeks, I'm fine now. I'm out there.
I mean, listen, whatever lets us go back to drinking out in New York City, I'm cool with.
Just seeing other people. And look, that was the weirdest thing about, I think, the pandemic, and one of the points of the book is that there have been these horrible crises along the way. New York
Hmm.
in the late 70s with the fiscal crisis and crime. I mean, it really was, as much as it was fun to be a teenager and be running around in that,
Hmm.
if you weren't, if you had your whole future ahead of you, it was one thing. But if you were trying to live through that, it was rough. And a lot of people were in pain, and the city was messed up. And there have been other crisis moments, that when Dinkins came in, it was peak AIDS and peak crack and peak crime. And again, people said the city's going down. It was the cover of Time magazine. The city, New York's over. And then 9/11, and everyone said, no one's going to live in a city again. No one's going to live in Manhattan. And people rushed off to Brooklyn. I mean,
Hmm.
it's never going to be, no one's going to want to live in a city. And a couple years later, it was bigger and stronger and, more dangerous in a
Hmm.
certain way than ever. And so I look at this moment we're having, and it's absolutely not like anything we've had since, we used to have smallpox epidemics or whatever, back in the 1840s and that kind of
Hmm.
thing. And people did exactly the same thing. People with money got the hell out, and I mean, it was exactly the same thing. But we have to look at it that it's a real opportunity for to make some changes, and the city does get up off its butt,
Hmm.
and really has every time after these crises found a way forward. So I think instead of, for me, let's not just make the answer go back and like give the businesses and the corporations exactly what they want so they come back. This time we have to ask people, like, okay, we're going to do some of that. People don't come to New York to be poor. Let's be frank. Even poor people come to New York hoping they're going to get rich. So
Exactly.
that's something we have to answer for all levels of people. But this time it's meaning answering it for all levels of people. Let's help people who are further down the ladder get some of the pie instead of like just hoping that it gets sprinkled down from top. So I think that's why we really need to talk about equity and stuff as we go forward this time around. But it can get better, and I think it will be, but it needs a lot of buy-in from young people because it's a very generational thing.
No, for sure. I mean, do you think that, you know, I guess what would you like to see implemented specifically, um, after the whole pandemic is, you know, over and done with?
Well, I mean, in a kind of in policy terms, you get out in the weeds here. I mean, I think housing really matters. I think housing is really important when you look at kind of the three cycles of the book that I have in there. You know, kind of the Koch Dinkins period and the Rudy Giuliani period and the Bloomberg period. Housing kind of came into play one way or the other, and especially under Koch, where it was helping a new generation of people move back to the city, basically my generation, you know, baby boomer people kind of move back into and repopulate the city. But there was also that big housing initiative that helped immigrants and a lot of people who, you know, weren't all white folks coming into the city working in offices, to build housing in neighborhoods that had been just vacant lots, had been completely blown out. And that played a major impact on cutting down crime because people were living in those places again. They became neighborhoods and communities again.
Right.
So as much as we talk about cops doing that stuff, it was really people, I think, who made the enormous difference in regrowing their neighborhoods and stuff. So I think in this case, housing's really important because it's time again for younger generations to be able to move into the city and make it their own. You know, that's what that's kind of the pages turning here. And that kind of involvement is really important, but we need people to be able to live here. You know, I mean, my own kids are like, am I going to be able to afford to live in New York? It's like, you grew up here. Yeah, I'd like to think so, you know, but they have to make choices too, you know, so it's not, it's across the board as to whether the city is going to remain for New Yorkers and not just kind of sold off to real estate investors from Taiwan or wherever the hell, you know?
Right. No, yeah. I mean, I every time I see somebody who has, you know, decided to make the move and come over here, you know, to New York City from, you know, some whatever flyover state or what have you, I always feel like I guess sort of grateful that I was, you know, grandfathered into the city, so to speak, because, you know, I was born here, and like I
Right.
don't think I would have the guts to do it myself, just how like insane the city is, like in every aspect.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like so like even with people coming from you know, coming over here to college, it's just I wouldn't do
Listen, and I'm
it.
from one of those flyover states, so you know, watch it with that. But you know, it always was, you know, and that's another thing to keep in mind with all this, you know, is that there are these kind of repeating cycles. You know, moving here in 1980, real estate, well, it was still always hard to find an apartment, but there was no Street Easy, there was no Zillow. Like you had the Village Voice that came out on Wednesdays, and that had all the apartments to share and rent basically. And you looked at obituaries, literally, to see if people were like who died and
Really?
where, and you'd go to the super and stuff. I mean, it was guerrilla war to get an apartment, you know, and they weren't cheap. You know, the same thing. We all had roommates. You all kind of got that place. I mean, that's been an eternal thing. A lot of it though is geography because we were wrestling over places on the Upper West Side and in the East Village and stuff. I mean, where it was, people were still coming over from Brooklyn to kind of move into the city. But after I graduated from college, the first place I looked, this was 1984, was in Greenpoint. You know, people are already looking in Brooklyn and we're living out there and we're kind of starting little beachheads all over the place. At the end of the day, I grew up in Chicago in a neighborhood where everybody spoke Polish, and I went to Greenpoint and I was like, wait,
Just at home,
I
right at
just
home.
left, you know, I just left Chicago, you know, so I went back to Manhattan and kind of dug in on the Upper West Side.
I'm like how in your book you also talk about, you know, downtown and like what that meant. Could you talk a little bit about that and like in
Yeah, I
your
mean,
experience?
it was a really exciting moment because you had the stuff going on in the South Bronx, kind of the graffiti art scene and hip hop. Really, you know, what Jeff Chang always calls the 7 Mile world. That kind of world of the different art streams of hip hop coming together: the dance, the graffiti art, the the music of it. And then you had an interesting scene going on downtown. You know, people down there that had kind of Greenwich Village has always been a place where people go to be artists, but there was another younger kind of couple generations that were there percolating, and they were able to kind of come together. You know, the Times Square show was an art show in 1980 at 41st, kind of in Times Square, and it was a takeover of these two, kind of what used to be a brothel. You know, it was like a beat up, and these artists just turned it into kind of a big art installation. It was the first place where Keith Haring showed. It was the first place where Basquiat was. David Hammonds, who has that new wonderful thing over on the river by the Whitney. He had things there, a whole just a list of great artists, all young artists, all just showed stuff there. It was open for a month, nonstop. Everybody just came and went. And it was this moment though, where like Fab Five Freddy came down and met a guy named Charlie Ahern, who I don't know if you know him, but then together they got together and they made the movie Wild Style. Have you ever seen Wild Style?
I still have not seen Wild Style.
Okay. I think we talked about that before.
Talked about this before.
That's your homework, all right?
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of the Rosetta Stone of exactly, do that. You know, it's kind of the Rosetta Stone of hip hop and that scene. Lee Quinones, who is maybe the greatest, kind of most legendary graffiti writer, is in it and is the hero of it. And it's a kind of loose story about getting into the New York art world and stuff, but all these famous early rappers are in it. It's amazing. You know, it's just, it climaxes with this big scene at the East River Amphitheater, this big concert. And it's just such a taste of what the time is. But that movie happened because of the Times Square show in Uptown and Downtown. And what was really most important about that whole scene was it was the first time when kind of the kind of Afro-Atlantic art scene pushed forward. Like it wasn't a total appropriation where people, you know, Pat Boone is taking, you know, blues music and shit. I mean, it was, you're in the, you know, the people of color were centered in the whole scene. And, you know, when Madonna is dancing with her dancers, she's dancing with them, not just in front of them. There was a sign of really, Charlie Ahern said, you know, we had kind of beat apartheid, you know, in that moment. And so it was really a generative kind of big bang moment, I think, for the East Village and arts in general, and just sort of asserting very early on a moment for that, you know, that kind of takes waves in the art world. And then in 93, there's another show at the Whitney, this is 93, so 28 years ago. It's all about the things we're talking about now, you know, with the culture wars and things like that. I mean, battles about multiculturalism and all this kind of stuff. It was all in that show. And the language that we use now is kind of there. So the discussions we're having now about art and culture and identity are kind of continuing battles, you know, and a couple really important moments that happened over these years. And I wanted to write about them and kind of contextualize them, help people learn about them, but also know that they're new to the battle, but the battle's been ongoing for a while.
Right. No, yeah. Do you think that like what role do you think the internet has played in, you know, the whole, I guess, you know, clicks or whatever you would call it?
Yeah.
Like has it made it, like, has it exacerbated it or has it made it better?
You know, I mean, it's all over the place. You know, it's like cars. You know, we all complain about, oh, cars have destroyed. Everybody made cars. You know, they destroyed their cities for cars and all this kind of stuff. But you know, cars get you to the hospital faster. Cars get you to visit your mom. You know, I mean, there's a lot of upsides on cars. You know, I mean, what would we do without them in a certain way? And I kind of feel that way about what's happened with the internet. We have, I think at the beginning it was like, oh my God, we can do anything. You mean I can just click that and it'll come tomorrow? And now it's like, oh, I click it and it comes tomorrow. It's had this devastating impact. And so when we talk about it in New York, there are huge pluses and there are huge minuses. You know, I think it played a major role in kind of blowing up the idea of a monoculture because you were increasingly able to kind of find things you want out there in the world. And that was a really good thing. It was really useful in helping the city learn how to take care of itself using technology and computers to kind of not just track crime, but, you know, track garbage pickup and stuff like that. I mean, really boring, mundane things, potholes, you know, a lot of that stuff really did get better because technology began to exist to deal with it. But the downside is that it helped fragment us, I think. It broke us apart and we find each other online. But I think it's kind of undermined our ability to kind of get face to face with each other. And cities are really based on, there's this great guy, Holly White, who was an urbanist kind of 60s, 70s, who was kind of the godfather of this idea that, um, cities are about helping people exchange, not just money, but other stuff. And we made it all about money during these years, but it's really about exchanging a lot of things, knowledge and access and cachet and caring for each other. I mean, there's a lot of different things there, right? And cities are about helping people put those things together, and if you want a city to be healthy, you got to have people in it. The streets have to have people, and there has to be action, and I think the internet has undermined that face-to-face quality to some degree. I mean, it's created new kinds of connections with people, which are really cool, and that's kind of that half and half good bad thing. Now you can find that person. On a very macro level, it's kind of undermined New York as the center where you went to do your own thing. In a geographical level, back in 1980, if you wanted to find a certain kind of thing or have the freedom to express yourself in a certain way, you did go to New York because it was one of the few places. And I think the internet has now let people in Tulsa and Colorado, and Salt Lake City experience some of that without having to leave those places. And I think that also helped New York become a little bit more like America, for better or worse, because we kind of didn't have to, it wasn't always about the craziness. It let in space for people to be, kind of lawnmower people,
Gotcha. I mean, the way I see it is like it's made communication a bit more intentional, right? Because
Mhm.
it it allows you to be like, hey, listen, I am looking for, you know, creatives in New York City. That's all I want. And then the people who are like, oh yeah,
Right,
I'm a creative in New York City, I'll do that. But it's also like the flip side to that is you also, put yourself in an echo chamber where, I'm only attracting people with my ideas. There's no like
right.
challenging of ideas, so to speak, unless you have like a public forum, which I think is, what New York City inherently is, right? Because there's just so much going on with so many people. It's the exchange of ideas, and that's what builds you as a person. You know what I mean?
Right. And your stuff gets beat up, it's
Yeah.
supposed to get beat up. The whole idea of New York is kind of bringing your stuff to market,
Hmm.
whatever it is. You're kind of putting it on the stage. And you're supposed to get smacked around a little bit. And people are supposed to say, nice try, but get back out there. And that
Right.
is kind of what it is. And I agree. When you're just going to, people like to just be reinforced and hear what they want to hear. And at the end of the day, what we really most need is a community and communities where we're able to talk about the differences and not just the thing we have in common.
Hmm.
Talking about differences and working through that stuff is really what binds a community together, not just kind of patting each other on the back.
Right. No, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
you know I mean, in art as much as anything else, same thing. So, I also, the other final thought, kind of on the internet, is that it's so much about delivering information
Hmm.
that sometimes I think it loses meaning. We've become so intent on just sort of delivering what we want to say, that it becomes, the goal is to sort of lose all the stuff around it, and that friction around it is where the meaning comes from. I think a lot of times I just think of, like, influencers. I don't know what to make of that, man. I'm just too old to wrap my head around that thing. It's just like, I don't know. It's just so delivery of delivery of picture money. It's a weird transaction that is not, I think, a great advance. But
I don't know. I generally don't understand the whole influencers thing. Like I get it. It's uh if a celebrity was my next door neighbor type feel, I guess. But I don't see the whole. I don't know. I
yeah,
don't
I
know.
mean, I can't. Style and fashion was something that you had a very serious and, crazy pretentious, crazy nuts, Diana Vreeland and all these people, but they did create. I mean, there was an art to it,
For sure.
with a sense of history. I mean, laden with all kinds of, I'm going to scrape away all the terrible things that they also brought along with it because they were there. It was very much a certain kind of vision, but
Hmm.
there was history. There was kind of a real conscious sense of what was being packaged in there, as opposed to just the image. here I am at a pool with a drink wearing this thing. There was a photographer styling this whole thing with, there was some real profound thought that went into it, which has seeped into our culture in a lot of ways, again, good and bad, but visually, some of those photos from the 40s and 50s are still images that we think of and use and just sort of assume. And I don't know that kind of do-it-yourself world is ever going to reach that level of outside of I'm sure there's some fascinating people doing it, but you're just never going to puncture that kind of level of interest, I think, and lasting quality that some of those other people brought to it.
It's all a matter of reach, right? Like, do you think that you'd be able to do something like that? Do you think you'd be able to hire, a stylist or like have that
Right.
vision? Probably not. So that's why it's going to be, a class again, taking a photo by the pool, drinking a martini or something. Like anybody could do that.
Literally, that's what's
Everybody
supposed to be
will.
so great,
Exactly. Yeah.
but all right, if you want to kill something, make it available to everybody.
Right.
That is something I never believed when I was young. I was like, everything should be available for everyone, and then you're like, oh, no one cares. They turn the page. It's sort of you kind of got to hold back a little bit, I think, to make people want stuff.
Human nature is funky like that. What made you go from novels to nonfiction books? 'Cause I think
Not selling enough novels was a big part of that.
you wrote 3 of them, right?
I did. No, and listen, they did nicely. They got like option for movies and stuff, and that was cool. And I really was something I always wanted to do growing up, was write novels and write fiction, and I like doing it. But it's not fun to write novels and not be able to make something of a living off of it, and not have people necessarily read it in droves, and the kinds of novels I liked writing, which had a lot of history in them, it just wasn't the time I was putting into it was sort of not paying off. But good enough. I was in the book business for a long time before that, so I really wanted to write, and so I started transitioning into nonfiction stuff. And wrote a biography about a guy who was head of the NAACP for a while. I did a kind of co-author. I ghost wrote and collaborated with Rudy Crew, who used to be chancellor of the school system. And then I just shifted into nonfiction. But the good part was that I brought with me a sense of character, a sense of plot, a sense of kind of narrative to writing history, which is the kind of history I like to read, to kind of take all of these academic things, which are brilliant, but aren't necessarily going to penetrate with people, to try to turn that into stuff that makes sense and is interesting and fun to read and
digestible.
People out.
It's just digestible history at that point.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. We call it narrative history. It is rather than like, there's a certain responsibility when you're writing a very academic history of kind of being complete and which is very important, and I'm not mean to denigrate that in any way, but sometimes you can lose, for the average reader, you kind of lose yourself in the weeds sometimes. Writing for history is different writing so that people 200 years will pick up this book and say, oh, that's the book on it. I'm a little more interested in people today picking it up and saying that's what the story is on it. I like writing things that help maybe people do something now. I wrote a book about Chicago between, kind of after World War II, when all these really interesting things we think about the United States began there, whether we're talking about Playboy magazine, McDonald's, Second City and Improv. There's all these different things that came out of there. And I think it was really helpful in getting people in Chicago, and again, a younger generation of Chicagoans, to see what had happened there and what the real possibilities of looking at the arts and people that grew out of Chicago, which was different than New York. And so the New York book comes at a really terrible time, but the timing ends up, I think, being hopefully useful. Maybe 2 years ago, people wouldn't think about the things I'm talking about in the book the same way. But now that we're kind of forced into a moment of thinking about changing the city, talking about this, looking back, seeing what was, and this isn't I hope it's not a depressing book. I hope you keep going. It's supposed to be kind of fun and give you a flavor of what the city really was like over these years. And I've been glad that a lot of people put it down and say, I feel optimistic. I want to do something and get out there and just be in the city instead of living on top of it. And I think that's what happened in so many in the last few years. That sense of gentrifying, that sense of people taking it over, was that people live on top of it and not in it, maybe the same way you did when you moved here 40 years ago or 30 years ago, when you really came to be a part of what it was instead of trying to make it into what you want it to be.
Right. Why did the book take you 8 years to make?
Because the
It's a long
original,
time.
it's a
It's a
long
long
time.
time.
It's a long time to, it's 35 years I was writing about. I went back and read basically every issue of New York Magazine from 1978 until now, and the New Yorker and stuff, because I wanted to not just get the information, but
The
I wanted to
context.
remember the stuff around it, like
Right.
the ads, like what was hot, what were people wearing, what were at clubs, who was playing at certain places, because all that stuff that seems kind of incidental, in those academic histories, to me that's the glue that's holding it all together. These are the fact that there are people walking past each other, that are doing interesting things and connecting with each other. That's the story of a city to me. So kind of getting a wraparound of what's going on took a lot of time. I interviewed a lot of people, try to, get a sense of firsthand from people what was going on. And, a lot of research, just a lot of research. And then the original draft was about twice as long as what you have in your hand. So there was some time just cutting and melting it down and kind of working with the text after that to make it work.
So I
That
don't
adds
feel
up to eight
so
years.
I don't feel so bad than not finishing the book, right?
No, but
If
I want you to.
it
It
took
would be
you eight
nice.
years to write it,
It's,
it'll take me like 4 to read it, I guess.
keep rolling. The thing is, I think it gets more from the people I've talked to. I think once you start to recognize yourself in the story, because I remember working on it and like, okay, now I'm up to when I met my wife. Up now I'm up to now I'm married. Up now I have a kid. And in that way, for me, it was interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is weirdly autobiographical in the background because I was
Mhm.
sort of seeing myself in it too. And I think the people I've talked to have read it, if they're from New York and have lived in it, kind of find like, oh, here's where I come into the story. And,
Right.
and it kind of adds a different layer of engagement.
Yeah, for me, it's probably not gonna be until like Bloomberg because I don't remember Giuliani.
Well, I mean, kind of lucky you, but, it was a weird, great time, but it was horrible,
Yeah.
but also really nice. Life in the city profoundly changed for the better on a kind of day-to-day level,
Hmm.
but for a lot of people it got dangerous and scary, for reasons that were all about him and trying to exercise control. And it was a weird trade-off, of that people didn't necessarily pay attention to at the time at all, even though they were conscious of it.
Hmm.
So
Out of like the last, out of the 5 mayors that you speak about in your book, like who do you think has had the most profound, uh, you know, effect on the city?
I mean, it's so hard to say in a way. I mean, I would guess I would have
Yeah.
to say, I mean, just because in a way, that's why I broke it down into
Hmm.
these kind of different cities, because over these years, it stays New York, but it becomes a different city every time. It is a different place. And the city it's going to come out now is going to be different than what was before. It's
Hmm.
still going to be New York. But I mean, I guess I would have to say Koch, because a lot of what Bloomberg does, a huge number of people who work for Koch end up working for Bloomberg. The kind of ideas of public space and public art and trying to bring people out back into the city and stuff are ideas that Koch brings people in, and it's his people that make that stuff happen, and they kind of stay throughout this period, except during Giuliani, who has his own weird cast of characters. They come back under Bloomberg and are given a lot of power. So a lot of that kind of reimagining of Bloomberg is really based on ideas that Koch let happen. So I
Hmm.
guess if I had to pick who was the most important, it probably would be Koch. Just for that reason. I mean, Giuliani left such a weird legacy, but again, I don't think he would have been able to come in and do a lot of the stuff he did without people under Koch having identified problems and made it possible. It's like the boiler was broken, and Giuliani, there's all the tools are laid out and like arrows to what has to be fixed. So I think he didn't have to do anything in a certain way to detect problems. He came in and started doing things.
Hmm. Are you concerned or hopeful for the city?
I am concerned and I am hopeful. I don't think it's that
It's an
is not,
honest take.
yeah, I mean, that's, you gotta be, I mean, there's a huge, this election's going to be monster, I mean, what people do in June in the primary, and eventually November is going to be really meaningful, not just because of the mayor, but you have 38 new council members coming into the city council out of 51. So that's a lot of new people who will have a lot to say about what the future of New York is like. So that on one level, that's already a thing that is really big. And it'll be really interesting to see what kind of recovery we have. I'm fully confident that New York is going to get back up. I just hope that the nature of it is something that's going to be long term, because if we just keep doing the same thing we've been doing, it's going to come crashing down again. And I think we just need to do something that's more, as again, a little more bottom up, to help firm up the bottom, to help firm up the middle class, small businesses, people on the street. Let's build that bottom again, because that was what New York was famous for in the 30s and stuff, of being a kind of tough guy, little guy, kind of positive place. We need that again, and not just the rich guy place. They were seemingly more balanced before. And so I hope we have a mayor coming in and an administration coming in that's open to that, and a business community that participates and helps, a real estate community that understands that people need to spend money on things other than rent. And people talk about, real estate's down. I'm not fully convinced that's a bad thing, because it means maybe you can spend some money on food or clothes or the other things that people buy in New York.
But only in certain brackets, though. Like the rental prices are only down in the higher priced apartments.
Right.
Like
Right.
the lower priced apartments, they're not going to go any lower. It's just
The sort of,
impossible.
the issue there
Yeah,
is trying to find more units and more places to, I mean,
yeah.
that's that percentage that we spend on, everyone spends on housing, is enormous. It's crazy.
And then even if you wanted to buy a house, like right now is probably the craziest time for a buyer to even try to do that, because there's like bidding wars left and right, and people just
Right.
dumb
Well,
amounts of money.
but one of the things that's, I mean, I think, looking at the book, is how different that was over the years, and it's not always, again, it's not always been this way. In the mid 70s and the late 70s, so many of buildings that went co-op, and mostly co-op, were all rentals. And then the families that owned the buildings decided to get out of renting. And so a lot of buildings, hundreds of buildings, went co-op, which meant at that time they could just have plans where everyone got evicted. I mean, it was big. And so people, they get like a notice, would go around the building, what kind of plan you're going to do. And people had to decide, do I have the money to buy my apartment? Do I want to buy my apartment? I mean, they were really pushed to making decisions that we talk about now in terms of dislocation. But that happened, throughout Manhattan, to a lot of people, middle-class people, who ended up getting shoved out to the suburbs by turning buildings into co-ops. And this was at a time when interest rates were through the roof. You couldn't even get a mortgage at certain times. Inflation was like 10, 15%, which is just whack, I mean, so there were, my kids are like, oh, everybody had it so easy then. And, it was not. There were struggles that people had that were different, but the way we do real estate, the way we do a lot of things, are not the way they always were. And it's useful to keep that in mind.
Gotcha. Usually I like to end off this podcast asking, the same question to every guest I have on. How do you feel like New York City has changed you?
It's maybe more open to just embracing the world. I mean, Chicago is a great place, and it's a great place to kind of cook up ideas, and it is open to people. But New York is just so, it's like a big swamp. I always compare it that way. Like, things come and they go, and some people stay, but there's this kind of flush of people and ideas and capital of all kinds, and then it comes in, and just feeling that, just being able to appreciate what's coming in, and being not digging in and fighting it, but really embracing that constant change that's going on, is, I think, unlike anything in any other city in the world.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any final words to just leave out the podcast with?
Uh, the book is New York, New York, New York, 4 decades of success, excess, and transformation, available at bookstores near you, Amazon if you need to. And, it'd be great if you read it. It'd be fun.
And where can people reach you?
I got a website, just thomasdyja.com. My email's on there. You can reach me through there. Read the book, ask me questions. I mean, it's I enjoy that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate it. Had a lot of
Cool.
fun.
Thank you, David. Same here, man. Take care.
Take care, man.